Do you know what two of the worst words you can say to an entrepreneur are? Hi, this is Shannon Waller, and welcome to the Team Success Podcast. Last week when I was working with some team leaders, I heard an expression that really cued me into the fact that I think this is almost the worst possible thing you can say to an entrepreneur, because it will almost guarantee that you get no result. So what is that expression? It's no rush. Have you ever asked someone to do something and you said, oh yeah, no rush, and then you wait and you wait and you wait and you wait, and it never shows up? And you're like, by the way, whatever happened to that thing? They're like, oh my gosh, so glad you reminded me. And then they scurry to get it done. Now, I'm totally stereotyping as I do this, so please listen to this with a sense of humor and a smile. But I really laughed because if someone says no rush to me, it promptly falls off my to-do list. If I think about it, if I have time someday when, and in the midst of everything else that's pressing, that's deadlines with travel and client things and unexpected requests that come up and to-dos, your thing just fell right off the edge. So I don't think that's probably what we as team members want to have happen with our requests. Now, there are some people that you know are hyper productive, and no rush is true because you know they're going to get to it. But if your entrepreneur or the person you're working with is not one of these people, I want to encourage you not to say that. And there's a little bit more behind this, and I kind of want to appreciate the mindset of the person that you're speaking with. If you are working with someone who is very deadline oriented, who is driven by a sense of urgency and finds that energizing rather than draining, then no rush actually doesn't give them a useful piece of information. What is much more useful, and how you can take action on this, is to be very specific about the time frame that you're looking at, and then work with them to see whether or not that's in fact doable. So for example, if you say, oh yeah, by the way, can you just give me a final approval on this marketing piece, for example, or something that you're asking for a final result on. And you say no rush. Now, every single thing that comes in with a smidgen more urgency or priority immediately gets put ahead of your particular task. And it may not even take them that long. Final approval for something doesn't have to take forever, but you've just said that your thing was not a priority. You may think that you're being generous, that you're giving them lots of time. That may be what you appreciate as a team member. But frankly, for someone who is deadline or urgency driven, you've just sunk your own ship. So again, I say this with a lot of compassion because if you've been listening to the Team Success Podcast, you know my passion is to connect people more powerfully and have them be more successful in their communication. And this just cued me the other day. I was like, oh, this is a problem. So here is my coaching. Here is my suggestion that instead you are really clear about your sense of urgency. You don't want to cry wolf. If it's not due in 20 minutes, don't say that it is. No, lying is not... It's not exactly what I'm recommending, but provide really, really clear deadlines. And you don't actually have to justify them a ton. Just say, hey, if I can get this back by 2:00, or if I can get this back by Thursday, then I can make sure it gets out on time and we can meet our deadline. Well, that is like great. Then they can prioritize in the other things that they have to get done to make sure that that works. And it also puts you in the place of having clear and direct communication. And for a lot of people, that's actually not a habit that they're in. And I've run into a bunch of circumstances lately where people think that they are being clear and direct, and maybe from their culture or maybe from their background or maybe from their family environment, what have you, they think they are. But for the person that they are talking to, they are not. Just to give you a little bit of an example for this, when I first started working with Strategic Coach, I was in sales. And this was a long time ago, 1991. For a long time, we just sold to other Canadians. And then we had the opportunity to work with Americans and actually sell our workshop program in Chicago, the Strategic Coach program. Well, the first time I talked to an American, this is going to sound really funny if you're an American, it was a bit of a culture shock, just to tell you. And here's kind of how the conversation went. I was like, okay, I'm calling from Strategic Coach. Blah, blah, blah. Here's a little bit about what we do. He pretty much said, it wasn't quite, why should I care? But it's like, what difference will this make? And I was like, Of course, this is my Canadian interpretation. All right. So please take this with a grain of salt. And I thankfully somehow out of the depth of my being figured out how to reply in kind, because he said, what difference will this make? And I said, you make a lot more money in a lot less time. And I just was quiet. And he goes, Interesting. Tell me more. Now, probably wasn't quite so curt as I'm making it out to be, but it felt like that for my little Canadian sensibilities. And I thought he was mad. Well, what he was simply direct. After a while, it became incredibly refreshing and I was appreciative. It turns out that I can be fairly direct too. And it was actually great to just say what I meant and be clear and be specific. And if there was a timing issue, I could be clear on that too. And they appreciated that from me and I appreciated that from them. And I learned how to sell very successfully to Americans. But it took a little bit of training. Thankfully, that gentleman responded appropriately, like with tell me more, which I did. I don't remember whether or not he became a client, but it's kind of irrelevant because he taught me what I needed to know, which is that if I can simply mimic the pace and the intentionality behind the words, we can communicate really, really, really well. So that's really what I want to encourage you to do. So if you work with a fast talker, if you work with a fast thinker, if you work with someone who's clear and direct in their communication and says what they mean and doesn't maybe appreciate the subtleties of how you're trying to say something, then that's kind of how you want to be too. Some people are so good at cushioning things and making hard things sound softer that I actually know of a circumstance where someone was fired and didn't know they were fired. You do not want this to be you. You do not want to go to that extreme. So whether it's talking about timing, such as my example is no rush, I just really, really want to encourage you to get very good at clear, direct communication, particularly around deadlines and priorities. And you might be concerned about how this is going to be received. Someone reminding you about a deadline you perceive as nagging, probably the last thing in the world you want to do is to nag someone. But as someone who actually does appreciate prompts, I don't see it as nagging. You know, it's like, hey, Shan, you were going to do this. How's that going? I'm like, oh, thanks for the reminder. Got distracted or something else happened. And I actually really appreciate that. And I now structure prompts into my world. I have pretty much a professional prompter who works with me because I've got a lot in my brain. I respond in the moment. It's just not in my skill set, in my mental energy set to do that. So I actually really appreciate it. And it's not nagging. And the tone with which people do it is not like, oh, you should have remembered. It's more like, hey, it's time for you to focus on this now. I'm like, awesome. And then I get right to it. So I don't resist it. So prompting your team leader, your entrepreneur, your deadline-driven person can be really key. Again, short, simple, direct, even if it's not your natural communication style and not in your profiles, all of us can learn to communicate that way. So if you're finding that your stuff is not being prioritized, your deadlines are not being met, a little coaching to not say no rush, but in fact to be very clear, specific, and friendly about the deadline that you need, work it through with them to see whether or not they need any support. And I just know that now your projects will not be the ones that go to the bottom of the list. In fact, they'll get done in a timely and prompt manner, and you'll be much happier, and so will the person that you're working with. I hope this is helpful and useful communication coaching for you. If there's any questions or comments, please let me know at questions@strategiccoach.com. And as always, here's to your team success.
The Team Success video series is a brand new online learning platform to give your team the tools to thrive in an entrepreneurial business. Whether you have 5 team members or 500, Shannon Waller provides expert strategies for confidence, harmony, and success. You're just one click away at teamsuccessvideoseries.com.